I want to welcome everybody to this 11:20 breakout session on legislative initiatives, problem solving by negotiation. My name is Derek Monson. I am Vice President of Policy at a think tank here in Salt Lake City called Sutherland Institute. It's been around since 1995. I've been there for 15 years, and one of our priorities is the issue of religious freedom. Before I start my remarks and then kind of frame this discussion and then pass it to our expert panel, as I see everybody here, I'm reminded of a joke by Jerry Seinfeld. He referenced a public opinion poll about the public's greatest fears. The number one greatest fear was public speaking in public. Number two was death. And his joke on that is that means if you have to be at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving a eulogy. And in some ways, that reflects how I feel. But this breakout session is going to focus on initiatives that have advanced religious freedom through legislative negotiation. Before we get into that, into those examples, I want to take a moment to talk about and frame the conversation by focusing on why we're talking about this at all. And to do that, I think it's helpful to start with a little brief story. A number of years ago, a group of people were chosen to represent the nation and got together to make important legislative decisions. They came from many different walks of life, many different geographies, had clashing ideologies in lots of cases, prioritized political and philosophical principles differently, and in some cases simply had clashing values. They often disagreed passionately and candidly with each other, and they had to wrestle through things of who would wield political power, the deep moral disagreements, controversial and polarizing issues. But despite all this, they managed to find a consensus-driven compromise that allowed people to resolve issues in a practical sense and move forward on to the next issue. Their solutions oftentimes were complex, they were messy. From our modern values, in some cases, they were morally repugnant. But that said, they were also, again, practical solutions that allowed things to move forward. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, the group of people I'm talking about, we usually refer to as the nation's founders, and the compromise they struck we refer to as the United States Constitution. I'm telling a story in this way just to highlight two basic facts of American political and civic life that I think relate to how we go about trying to advance the interests of religious freedom. First, it highlights how our system of government and civic life generally is designed to progress primarily through legislative negotiation and consensus arrived at through compromise. In a nation that is geographically, ethnically, racially, and ideologically diverse as the United States, only consensus-driven legislative compromise through negotiation allows a broad number of people, interest groups, and political power players to find their moral passions fulfilled and their personal interests served in the laws that get enacted. To put it differently, it's the only way for broad groups of people with significant differences and divisions to unify and claim a personal victory in the advancement of the kind of religious liberty that serves the common good, and then move on to another issue. And a second fact is this story highlights that our nation has, from its beginning, from its birth, been embroiled in the kinds of deep moral disagreements, polarizing ideological confrontations, and battles for political power that we see today, and that we see in the debate over religious freedom. It's nothing new, and it's certainly not new in that debate about religious freedom. But reaching consensus through legislative negotiation and compromise was not beyond the capacity of the founders, and arguably the issues they dealt with were much more challenging than some of the issues we deal with today. And it's not beyond our capacity, I believe. And I think the presentations from the panelists will illustrate that. So what happens then if we don't go down this path? You know, if we focus primarily, as been discussed in panels and discussion today, on court cases and trying to just kind of resolve all of our religious freedom questions in the courts. Well, simply put, if that's our only avenue, our system of government and peaceful civic life ultimately will break down. And we've seen this. What has taken its place in modern times is the argument that we're told to view political opposition as a sign of some moral depravity or intellectual dysfunction, ignorance, and depriving the opposition of power in that environment becomes just as important, if not more so, than actually advancing the interests that we claim to cherish. over the last several decades, I think United States Congress has provided kind of maybe the most high-profile example of that in action. And what is left is a system that serves primarily the interests of kind of the smallest fraction of the political and ideological elite, and encourages the broader public to really change how they view our system, our system of democracy, of a democratic republic, because what's left in that context often becomes a genuine obstacle to people fulfilling their personal hopes and their community aspirations. And so they open themselves up to different ways of governance because the current way of doing things is failing them. So to contrast that with that kind of grim portrait of civic and social decline, I think there remains great hope in the United States and America for renewal of religious freedom and our civic health generally through legislative negotiation and compromise, especially looking at it from the lens of the state and local level and moving up from there. Specifically, if we focus on public policy reforms that generalize accommodations for particular religious practices and religious expression of faith traditions that remain largely unknown to large swaths of America. So a few examples, right? Judaism, Sikhism, Islam, Hinduism, and others. We can knit a fabric of statutory protections that make the First Amendment effectual in the ways that people interact with the law most at the state and local level. And then again, move up from there. That's been our approach at Sutherland Institute, beginning in the areas of higher education, which you actually hear from one of our panelists, or hear about from one of our panelists, and more recently expanding to the area of K-12 public education. We hope over time to expand this approach in areas of policy including health care, criminal justice, employment, and other aspects of life. And with that, I will start passing the baton to the people you probably came really to hear, people here on my right. I'll just introduce all of them briefly, and then each of them in turn will get up and speak. And then we will deal with questions with what time we have left at the end of the session. So starting with Marcus Faust. Marcus is President and CEO of Marcus G. Faust Attorney at Law and serves on the Executive Committee of the First Amendment Partnership. Prior to starting his own firm in Washington, he was a legislative counsel of Congress and has worked on many federal religious freedom statutes and bills, including the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, and the Fairness for All Act. Next to him is Eric Patterson. He's the Executive Vice President at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. His previous professional experiences include serving as Dean of the School of Government at the Regent University, Associate Director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, as well as 2 stints at the U.S. Department of State, and serving as a White House Fellow, along with, last but certainly not least, 20 years as an Air National Guard Commander. And finally, on the well, I don't mean this symbolically, on the far right of the table, I guess the far left from your perspective, again, not symbolically, is Cody Nielsen. He is the founder and executive director of Convergent Strategies and director of the Center for Spirituality and Social Justice and instructor at Dickinson College. For more than 15 years, he's worked on issues of religious, secular, and spiritual equity, including work on civil rights and encouraging what he calls critically engaged pluralism. So we have a great panel, and we'll start with Marcus.
Good morning. It's great to be here with you. I'm pleased to be back on campus, if not just because of the intellectual challenge of this discussion, which I've devoted my life to, but to see old friends like 2 classmates from the early classes here at the law school and other friends from around the country, colleagues that work with me in Washington, D.C. On the Fairness for All initiative that we're involved with. To put my comments into a context, I'm a registered lobbyist, okay? And you say, it's very difficult sometimes to explain to people what a registered lobbyist is and does. But in effect, we advocate the interests of our clients before the basic institutions of our federal government. And they say, well, how do you do that? And really, the only way I can explain it is that I translate their interests and needs into the language that's spoken in Washington, D.C. And that's one language. the language of politics. And so my remarks are really going to be more political in nature, and I think it's apropos to the topic because I think without a keen understanding of the political forces that drive decision-making in Washington, you cannot achieve success in legislative religious freedom protections. By way of my church assignment for many, many decades, I have been the church's eyes and ears in Washington, along with a few others, on religious affairs matters. And I have been involved in literally dozens of legislative initiatives on behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of those was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I was the church's weekly representative in those negotiations. It was an extremely different environment back then. In fact, does anybody here know who the House co-sponsor was of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was Congress's response after the Supreme Court struck down the religious protections in the Sherbert case? Anybody know who that brave soul was? Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer was a member of the House of Representatives. Democrats were in charge. He was the original sponsor of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Look where he is now. And who was the lead sponsor in the United States Senate? This is easier, guys. Teddy Kennedy. Okay? So two icons of the Democratic left, Schumer, right, and Kennedy were the lead sponsors of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And Orrin Hatch was also a sponsor, original co-sponsor. His name appeared second, however, on the bill. Now, that tells you how things have changed, right, in Washington, D.C., understanding those shifts. The bill passed unanimously out of the House, and there were very few who opposed it in the United States Senate. And it went immediately down to the White House, and guess who the president was who signed it? Bill Clinton. And it was my privilege to accompany then Elder Ballard as a representative of the church to the Rose Garden signing ceremony for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And everyone there gave talks that extolled the importance of religion in America, the values that it imbues. And President Clinton himself was particularly eloquent in giving voice to the importance of protecting religion in America. In fact, Elder Ballard's comment to me was, as we left the White House, that talk could have been given in General Conference. And then things began to change for people of faith, people of religion. And 4 years later, when the Supreme Court struck down RFRA, at least as it applies to the states, Congress again wanted to respond, and we were crafting ways around it. But in those short 4 years, there had been a significant shift. In the original political coalition, we had the ACLU on our side. We didn't have them on our side in 4 years later. That's why we were really only able to pass the Religious Institutionalized Person Land Protection Statute, right? Because we didn't, that's all we could agree upon at that point in time. And the ACLU was moving that way because of influence of the emerging political force of the LGBTQ movement in Washington, D.C., who did not want to place such tremendous advantage, the way they saw it, advantage in the court systems for religious plaintiffs and defendants. Now, as we fast forward to today, I'm engaged very heavily in the Fairness for All legislation, along with Stephanie Summers here, who you'll hear later on, and Marian Edmonds-Allen, who you heard from this morning. And the effort, I will tell you that as a kind of a operator of, as they said this morning, realpolitik, When they came to me and said, and it was my friend Nathan Diamond from the Orthodox Union who came to me and said, we need the church to join our effort to try and pass the Utah Compromise in the Congress at the federal level. I said, there's no way we can do it politically. We can't. Things have changed since then. I'm optimistic, more optimistic now than I have ever been. Why? Because the politics have changed. And how has the politics changed? We have gone about reaching across the aisle, forming friendships and alliances with individuals and groups, including those forces who really control America's politics, the money, and brought together people who of common interest decided now's the time to try and solve this problem. So how did that shift happen since we began the effort federally? First thing is it took an interest on the part of both religious protagonists and LGBT individuals to try and find common ground. And there was an organization called the American Unity Fund. And they first held a conference in New York, invited a few people up for preliminary conversations. Then after we assembled a religious group, we went to the Capitol Hill Club. Anybody been to Washington know what the Capitol Hill Club is? It's the Republican Club, okay? And there we are meeting for 2 days to just get acquainted and talk friendships and relationships. I will tell you now that the president of the American Unity Fund is one of my closest friends. He and his husband are the funniest people. They love Utah. They love the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. During the pandemic, they got a dog and they named him Brigham. And he basically said to me once, because we still tried to meet during the pandemic remotely, he said, I tell you, I'm so impressed with your church. I think that we just ought to, during the pandemic, turn the country over to Costco and your church to run. And this weekend, he now is on a farm in Georgia, and he's hosting individuals from staff from Congressman Chris Stewart. That's the kind of close friendships that we have developed. Stephanie, tell me if I'm saying anything that's inaccurate. They're just good people. And we value each other as brothers and sisters. And we're working side by side. We talk almost every day in some form about the right political strategy to form a consensus. Now, I want to contrast the legislative solution to the previous discussion that was had with Gene Scheer and Fred Geddix and these and our other esteemed lawyers. Do you know who the witness was for the church, right? At the Religious Freedom Restoration Act House Judiciary Committee hearing was Dallin Oaks. It was my privilege to accompany him. Since then, we've had an ongoing discussion about religious liberty. And about 3 years ago, when I was particularly discouraged about our legislative solutions, I came to the conclusion the only way we were really going to effectuate protective change was by appointing more conservative judges and taking these matters up to the Supreme Court and winning them there. Many of you may remember Elder Von Keach, excellent lawyer, close friend. He and Elder Oaks were in Washington, D.C. attending a religious liberty conference. They came over to my office. We had lunch. And I was about to ask him, he wanted a report on where we were legislatively, and I was about to give it to him. He said, Marcus, I sure hope that you can give me some good news on the legislative front because I don't see any hope for the courts. And I began to think, we just need to have more faith in our legislative efforts. And because I've seen the Lord move mountains, honestly, if he wants to, on what I view as religious liberty issues, like amending the Immigration and Nationality Act, the only amendment that's taken place in 20 years to that statute to allow undocumented members of our faith to serve missions. Okay? To me, that's a matter of religious liberty, their religious liberty to serve and not have exposure for doing so. So we have a circumstance now, and I'm going to try and wrap it up. We have a circumstance now where we have a coalition of Seventh-day Adventists, other faith groups, and center and left organizations who have come together around a compromise. And it's a compromise that I think is far superior to achieving lasting outcomes in our society than any Supreme Court rules. Now, we've been unsuccessful, to be truthful. We've tried at bringing other faiths. Our closest allies in many things, the Catholic Conference of Bishops, have not chosen to join us. And they view the Supreme Court as the bulwark, right? They're going to protect us. And then Fulton came down. We're a little surprised. Or not Fulton, I'm sorry. The Bostock came down, and that surprised them, right? So what I learned from Elder Wickman was that even the protections of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that are in statute, it's still a balancing test, right? In order to achieve the greatest amount of specific religious liberty protections, you need to identify the conduct or protection that you want to have embedded into federal statute as a right. And so our approach is to amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act and embed those religious protections into that statute, together with protections for LGBTQ individuals. And we've gone title by title by title and found a great compromise. And I'm now encouraged, because politics is now beginning to weigh upon the Democrats, who see that they're about to lose control of the Congress. And we have, as Marion said, these state-based LGBT groups who are saying to the Washington lobbying groups that are just making it an industry. All they're about is fundraising. They're not about legislating. Look, we're tired. We need these protections. And they're coming in from 46 of the 50 states and lobbying their delegations. That's grassroots support. And the main reason why, and it's thematically been said earlier, the reason why it's a superior solution is because it achieves the greatest amount of popular support. It has a more lasting. When you can find compromise, you can bring together more interests and more stakeholders who support it. And that's why it is a far preferable solution than any other solution that I know of, and it's worth pursuing.
Well, good morning. My name is Eric Patterson. I serve as Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And let me first say my thanks to the team here. Cole Durham's been a friend for a long time of our organization. I'm grateful to Elizabeth Clark for all of her work on this. Brett Scharfs serves on our advisory board. One of BYU Law's outstanding alumna, Hannah Clayson-Smith, serves on our governing board. And so it feels like we have many, many friends, and I see other ones in the room, and we're delighted to be here. And my talk today is to brief you on what's often called the MED Act, a legislative approach to protect the medical conscience rights of healthcare providers. And we have good news. At about 5 p.m. last night, South Carolina passed that legislation, the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. At RFI, our mission is to achieve broad acceptance of religious freedom as a fundamental human right, as a source of individual and societal flourishing, as the cornerstone of a successful society, and as a driver of national and international security. So we have a broad sense across different sectors and domains of public life in the U.S. and around the world. Now, you've all heard in the news many of the types of egregious cases where a doctor or a nurse or medical student, their fundamental conscience has been violated by some sort of coercion. For instance, a medical or nursing student who's told that they have to sign an affidavit that they'll participate in an abortion, or the very well-known case from a couple of years ago at the University of Vermont's Medical Center, where a nurse was told that she was going into a procedure, she scrubbed up, she went inside, and then the doctor said to her, "Oh, don't hate me." And she had been tricked into participating in an abortion despite the fact that she was on a list of names of people who would not participate in abortions at the medical center. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these cases out there. So what this legislation is designed to do is to protect the fundamental conscience rights of doctors and nurses and mental health professionals in areas like euthanasia, abortion, transgender procedures, mental health services, and down the road, increasing experimentation in transformative medical procedures. Now, all of this is really rooted, as this conference is, into a concept of human dignity. Doctors, nurses, and others take an oath, and that oath begins with the principle of do no harm. And so it's not just protecting the dignity of the patient, but it's also protecting the dignity of that professional. In other words, do we really want our doctors or nurses to leave their moral convictions at the door before they go to work every day? And of course, the answer to that is no. So what needs protecting? And let me just mention 4 of the who's, if you will, who need protecting under this act. Of course, the first and the most obvious are healthcare practitioners. And that's a wide group. It's not just the lead doctor, but we're talking also in the areas of medical education, mental health professions, and the like. The second, of course, are medical institutions. Sometimes they seem like amorphous bureaucracies, but they're really people united around a common mission. And what would happen if we knocked out all the faith-based clinics in the inner city, or we took out Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish hospitals? The third are our payers, so professionals, institutions, but those who are paying. That means insurance. It means taxpayers who have convictions about what they don't want to support in this realm. And of course, last but certainly not least, are patients. And patients is an important category because we're not just talking about a patient who wants to have some limits on what is done to them, but what we're also talking about, most importantly, I think these days, the front line is really parental rights. Parents being the one to make the decisions about what happens in the medical cases of their children, not some sort of new ideology that says that their child should be changed through hormone treatments or radical surgeries or other experiments. Now, there are 2 nuances in these cases that I want to note. The first one is the idea of mandatory referrals. And what I often hear is, well, doesn't it protect the conscience rights of that doctor if he doesn't do it, but he just refers it to someone else who will? Well, if you take a deep breath for a moment and reflect on that, I mean, do you really feel comfortable when someone thinks that something is a sin or morally objectionable, and they're going to just pass the buck? They're going to pass the responsibility of that to someone else? Of course not. And so this difference between referral and performance, we need to protect the right to not refer. And then second, I'm sometimes told, well, this sounds very exclusive, Eric, and these medical conscience rights, don't we need to be operating from a principle of inclusivity? Well, what do we mean by inclusivity? Here's what I would say is the wrong view. The wrong view would be to say that all healthcare workers must be required or coerced to perform all procedures at all times on demand. I don't think we really feel comfortable with that, right? That's not inclusivity. Here's inclusivity. Inclusivity is when medical professionals can operate from their own firm convictions and values and support the patients from those communities that share their similar beliefs and values. Here's an example. Regina Faust is an African-American, female, Christian OBGYN. And she became famous 2 years ago because New York State was going to impose new legislation that would force OBGYNs in the state either to perform abortions or to refer their patients to them. So she wrote a famous open letter in which she said, as a woman and as a medical professional who's taken the Hippocratic Oath, how can I counsel a woman in one room about how to nurture life and then walk into the next room and kill it? I cannot do that. Now, we've been saying for a long time, particularly among OBGYNs, how do we find enough people of color? How do we find enough women to be OBGYNs? How do we find enough people to serve in their own communities to be trusted in these areas? And she's the type of person who would be run out of the industry, run out of this opportunity for service by this type of law. So, the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act in South Carolina and elsewhere is an important protection. Let me give you a status update of where this legislation is. In 2020, it passed in Ohio and Arkansas. And like I said, literally just last night, it cleared the final hurdle in the South Carolina Senate to pass. So what's next? Well, over the next couple of years, other states will take this up. Some already have. Texas took it up last summer, but you may remember that Texas had a chaotic legislative session where the Democrats left the state and very little passed. This looked like it was going to pass, and there just wasn't time. Texas meets only every other year with its legislature, so it'll be back up next year. But I'd say that what we need over time are also legislative protections that protect medical conscience rights in the areas of licensure, in the application to medical schools, in how we think about accreditation, in continuing education, and professional standards, and in standards of care. Now, let me just conclude by saying this. How could you help? Because I think a big theme in this conference is, what are the ways that I as a citizen, or I as a lawyer, or I as someone who could sponsor an event or something could help? So here's a few things. You could host a briefing or an event or a seminar around this in your church or your parish or in your community. Law schools like BYU Law School and other places around the country are going to need to provide, I think, increasing professional education for our graduate students to be prepared for these challenges. If you're an expert in the field, such as a mental health counselor or a doctor, and you would be willing to provide testimony, expert testimony down the road, or to ride on these issues, let us know. We would be happy to provide you with those types of opportunities. We need people who will explain this to the public. There is an education component. Many people I talk to think, oh, doctors are protected. They kind of do whatever they want. You know, that is really not the case in the society in which we live. And we need to do a better job of disseminating information about what these challenges are today. The good news is that legislators in 3 states have passed this legislation, and I'm optimistic about it in other places. It's one of the key ways that we can protect the faith convictions of our neighbors and these who serve us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm welcoming you to the afternoon, I think. I'm going to be real brief so that we have a chance to have some discussion and dialogue with all of everyone, and so that our moderator can field said questions. My name is Cody Nielsen. I'm the director of the Center for Spirituality and Social Justice at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Carlisle and Pennsylvania is a somewhat foreign place to me. I'm a Midwesterner, grew up in Iowa, in the cornfields of Iowa, and call Minnesota home, and have lived in Pennsylvania for a year. I'm also the founder and executive director of an organization called Convergence Strategies. Convergence Strategies focuses on research, policy, and practice that looks at issues around what we call religious, secular, and spiritual identities. So I want to think back for a moment for all of you, for all of the experiences that you've had in higher education, whether you're currently working in them, whether you're currently a student in them. And I want you to ask for a second whether or not your religious identity has ever been at threat related to three things. One, taking off for religious holidays. I want you to think about that for a moment. Secondarily, I want you to think about any dietary issues and accommodations that ever have affected you. Any access issues to those. And third, I want you to think about the ways in which you practice prayer, meditation, reflection, and whether any of those have ever come under threat. For millions of Americans that are in institutions of higher education, the question of whether their religious protections exist is not actually a question itself. It's a fundamental aspect of their being, something that has come under threat when they choose to go to college and whether they choose to practice their religion. There's this conversation that is emerging on college campuses amongst non-Christian identities of whether they have to choose to go to school and forego their religious identity until graduation. We'll call it secular until graduation. Across the country, though, the rise and the growth of religious minorities, especially our Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Jewish, and Buddhist identities, are showing us that in America's long history of higher education, there is yet one question of religious freedom to be carried out in our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Why is this issue of religious freedom so far and so long removed from higher education? Why has it stood so long in our conversations as being an afterthought or the next issue? I want to read one piece of framing from Harvard College in 1636, the first college in America founded. These words are printed on the Smith Gate of Harvard University, and they come from what is known as New England's first fruits. After God had carried us safe to New England, and we had built our houses, provided necessities for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. Harvard College, or Harvard University as it is now known, was established to educate ministers, Protestant ministers. Up until the Civil War, 263 private colleges and universities were founded, mostly to support Protestant and Catholic ministers. So in the cornerstones of one of the most foundational pieces of American society is baked a question of religious freedom, but a religious freedom that exists simply for Christians. Fast forward to today, in a world in which is changing deeply, a fundamental question exists within higher education whether we will act upon those religious freedoms to support all of those that are attending our colleges and universities. Many people today think that no faculty member could ever turn away a student who came to them claiming to have a religious identity exemption or a need to take off for a religious holiday such as Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Diwali, Holi, to be able to take off and to be accommodated around the practice of Ramadan and the fasting that takes place for so many, not just Muslims, but also Baha'i, Jain, Buddhists, and others around religious holidays. But so often the story of these religious minorities is exactly the opposite. Threats of persecution, denial of this being an aspect of their identity which is worthy, a named secularism that exists on our campuses, and a reprise that requires a student to choose between their academic achievement and their religious practice. Miss the class, miss the test, fail the test. These have been heard over and over and over again. So, 10 years ago, when I completed a study looking at the experiences of religious minorities on college campuses, I realized this threat was baked into policy and practices of the institutions. I sought out to change the way in which we talked about the interfaith movement on campus, the work of pluralism, the work of religious freedom, and started asking administrators, staff, faculty, presidents, and boards of trustees how they wish to approach this. Most of them, like many of those out in society that do not work in higher education, were both surprised and appalled. I said that the religious minorities in the room are not surprised, but they are appalled. The response has been an upswell and growth of questions around how do we embed, as so aptly has been said by our other panelists, a sense of legislation that identifies and specifically names what is needed. In 2018, was contacted by a group of students at the University of Washington who were trying to pass a state or a Senate bill within their student senate to support Muslim students during Ramadan, to provide for and necessitate that faculty provided religious accommodations and allowed for the students to have alternative testing times, because taking your chemistry final at 4 p.m. after fasting for 12 hours doesn't usually go well. The student senate passed the bill, the president agreed to the bill, and the faculty senate also agreed. After the school year was completed, the students asked to do more. They said we could take it to the state. And we agreed to broaden a coalition and talk about more than just Ramadan, but religious accommodations at all, if you will. We went to a senior ranking state senator in Washington state, and with his help in championing a bill in 2019, Washington state became the first state in the United States to require a religious accommodations policy to be stated on every single syllabi at every single post-secondary institution in the state of Washington. For those of you that are familiar with ADA standards and requirements of them being stated on syllabi, this is the exact same thing. A stated purpose and a required policy that the institutions came up with that provided an exemption that could not be sideswiped, that faculty could not hide or dismiss, that institutions had to carry out. Since that time, a further bill in support with the Sutherland Institute was passed here in Utah last year. The bill, which speaks again to the higher education institutions and the need for broader religious accommodations policies that are named and supported for students to remove power dynamics between faculty and students, was passed without a single dissenting vote in either chamber of the Utah House and Senate. Since that time, bills are moving in Ohio and in Massachusetts. 2 weeks ago, the bill passed in Ohio, not just without a single dissenting vote, but with every single House representative in the state of Ohio passing the bill. Now the question is, what comes next? The question still exists, not just of religious calendars, but of those dietary options that I spoke of the prayer and meditation and practices, and also for non-religious identifying students to be able to be given protections in the same way as we have protected those on our campuses already. There's a growing conversation about whether or not, along with the Fairness for All Act, whether there is a need, very similarly to Title IX and what happened in 1972, as to whether there need be a piece of federal legislation to protect every single college student in America, to allow them the same religious protections. And the reason why I believe, and we believe as an organization, that this is so critical and that higher education need be a focus of our work is that all we need to do is to think about and think back to the impact that higher education had for us. the way in which our society is claimed, framed, and reformed inside our institutions when we are students, and what our institutions do to affect our society. If our 18 to 25-year-olds do not see religious protections and religious freedom playing out and mainstreaming and normalizing that each and every one's identity of their religious preference or their non-religious preference is upheld by policies and practices and standards, then we risk a world that will remain discriminatory and hostile toward religion at large. Institutions of higher ed are themselves a container that offers an opportunity for us to provide the solutions to our society and to practice in a laboratory what we want the broader society to be like. It helps our students, and we believe that this work is critical. And we hope that you can join us in this. And if this is something that you've never heard of before or you've never thought of, we'd be happy to be talking more about it. I'm going to stop so we don't go over our time.
All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions because I'm sure everybody's anxious to get to lunch, and we will end on time. I would like to start with just one question, and then we'll go to audience questions. For anyone on the panel, I believe we have a roving mic. Is that right, that we can bring up? The question is, how do you, you talked about areas of healthcare, education, and the federal legislation. Amidst that, how do you navigate the passionate moral disagreements in ways, coming from people with different perspectives, different life experiences, in ways that are respectful of their values, their lived experiences, but still allow you to navigate the politics of the culture war, move things forward, when all of that is kind of stacked, against things moving forward? Just like to have the panel respond to that.
I would just start by saying two things. The first one is by having a loving demeanor, and we heard about that from in this first presentation. And so, and second, to be educating who our interlocutors, even if we're in disagreement with them, about the common good, the neighbor love, the golden rule types of approaches that underscore what we're doing. And that's a good corrective for us all the time anyways, right? Is what's motivating both the policy part of this, but also my attitude towards this, that I truly, truly believe that this is in the best interests of everybody, and it's motivated by love. So, and that can give you not kind of a wimpy, doormatish type of approach. It can give you a really steely resolve to be fighting for the common good, but to do it in a way that's not hateful. That's the key.
I really agree with that. Coming from a posture of hope and love, in the work that we're doing, we often ask legislators to tell their stories of their own religious or non-religious identity and about the value and the importance that it brings to them as individuals. And then from that, we can often share about how mutually, in a nonpartisan way, the work that we're trying to do upholds all of that. I could be sitting with Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar at the exact same time, and very similarly, they would speak to how important and how much they value their religious identity. And it has been remarkable as we have brought legislators from across the aisle together to have conversations about being co-sponsors or sponsors on these bills, about how, when they hear each other, how passionate that they become about this issue.
I want to agree with my panelists that identifying someone's identity, I think, is central, and that's really viewing them as your brother and sister, because that is, in Christianity, the commandment to love our brothers and sisters. And I'm reminded of an invitation that I received very early from the president of the American Unity Fund. He brought together to a brown bag lunch all of Washington's LGBTQ advocacy groups, many of whom did not agree with what we were doing. And I was the featured speaker. I invited my granddaughter, who was my intern at the time, to go because I thought they might be a little easier on me. And they were so kind, and I asked advice about what I should comment on, and he said, just talk about your identity, who you are, what's your upbringing, what's your experience. And so I shared my ancestry and how central to my own identity my faith is. And then as they began to share their own stories, I began to see that they themselves have their own experiences. And so recognizing the need to see everyone as a brother and sister, and to recognize that they have their own hopes and aspirations, is the beginning of finding that common ground and getting past all of the difficulties. We're just people after all.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one or maybe two questions. If you could briefly state your question and ensure that it ends with a question mark, not a exclamation point. I'm going to repeat it into the microphone for purposes of the video recording, and then you can keep the mic up there for the panelists. You can raise your hand first back there.
So, Lady Bird said that the environment is where all we have the mutual interest. It is the one thing all of us share. It is only a minor, or it is only a mirror of ourselves, but what we see depends on what we can become. So I hear a lot of disparity between two, it's like, them and us. And so this is an inclusive solution that isn't a minority or non-majority and majority. It's an inclusive solution. What if we were to say we would like to create really community resiliency? If there's an emergency that we can actually take care of ourselves and our neighbors, and we have an action plan, wouldn't that actually include a lot of this disparity between the two groups and 3 or 4 outliers? That it's an inclusive group of people that come together. Wouldn't that be a good place to start instead of always having somebody that doesn't look or feel like us that we bring together? Now we are all one, and that is the goal. And I just wonder if how we would move forward with including that in this conversation.
Okay, so the question is, should we start with this kind of inclusive approach that's been described as opposed to others? Go ahead.
So I'm going to make a controversial comment that I don't expect my other panelists to maybe uphold to. I agree with you in principle. My experience on the ground is that inclusivity is what the interfaith movement has done best without actually reaching towards civil rights and equity. We're asking those who have been most marginalized, including non-religious identities, to come to us and to have the conversation at the lowest common denominator. And we're not saying, but you are going to be protected. And that's where I disagree in some ways with it. I don't disagree with the principle of what you're talking about. I actually think it's fundamental. And I often ask, how, as we've done religious freedom work, have we self-examined? This is why I call it engaged critical pluralism. How have we engaged critically in an understanding of whether or not we are just simply asking people to come to the table without actually providing them the civil rights that we already are afforded, depending on our power dynamics of who's in charge? Yes.
Okay, does Eric or Marcus have a...
Do you want to comment on this? Maybe I know we're very although it says 9 o'clock and we're supposed to go to 2:20.
We got plenty of time, right?
It's 2:19. Take a minute.
Yeah, we have about 2 minutes left, so if you have a...
If you want to do another round.
Okay, I believe we have one final question here.
My question is for Marcus. I'm really inclined to applaud your work on fairness for all. My question is, would the fairness for all approach be possible before Over developed? Because or is it the case that one side had to fundamentally lose on an important issue before you could have that kind of a compromise? Or was there a fairness for all approach that could have happened in Congress instead of over the belt?
I've been working on religious liberty issues that were not specifically limited to LGBTQ issues. And in each one, there is a catalyst that causes people to come towards a compromise, and perhaps that is part of the catalyst with respect to some. I would say that in the case of my church, we were trying to reach out even before that and find common ground here in the state, in city ordinances, and elsewhere. So it might have had an impact nationally, but it did not have a specific impact on what the church was doing that I could see.
Right, that brings our session to a close. Hope you all enjoy your lunch, and if you join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.